From getting people to the polls to taking legislative power into their own hands, we're talking to the young lawmakers who are making black history right now. I'm Domati Pungo, and this is MTV News Need to Know. And joining us are Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott, who's been working to end the gun violence epidemic, restoring the public's faith in government, and doing it all while being his authentic self. Mayor Scott, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, man. I appreciate you making the time. And State Senator Tiara Mack is joining us from Rhode Island. She began as an activist there before representing Rhode Island's 6th District. She's been fighting for women's reproductive rights, affordable housing, and has been committed to making the office accessible to her constituents. In fact, you can go to a website right now and set up time for coffee. I don't even know if I've seen that before, and if that's not accessible, I don't know what is. Senator Mack, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And last but certainly not least, because he resides in my borough, Senator Jabari Brisport. He's the New York State Senator for District 25, which includes a number of Brooklyn neighborhoods. He's also using his background in activism as well as education and the arts to fight for equity for working families. Senator Brisport, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I want to start it off here because you guys have such impactful stories, and your identities are such an integral part of not only the policies that you stand for, but also how you present to the world, which inspired me to reach out to each and every one of you. So again, thank you for being here. I wanted to ask, and I'll start with Senator Mack, what made you decide to run?
So as you said, I was an activist in my city for a few years, and being at the State House, I saw that there were very few people who looked like me, very few people who had the stories of formerly low-income black women to inform their policies and their decisions. And so when the opportunity came up to run for office, I said, why not me? Someone who knows the stories of people in my community who look like me, who have these same stories.
And it's not insignificant either that, you know, the person you ran against was an incumbent Democrat who opposed abortion. And, you know, even though you're a Democrat as well, I mean, you kind of coming in there, it bucked the status quo. You know, what inspired you to go against someone who had been serving at the state legislature for so many decades?
So my opponent had been in office for 30 years, and this is someone who'd been most people's math teachers, had been a prominent public figure, but someone who was also checked out. After 30 years in office, it's really hard to keep that same energy and feel like you're still connected to the same community. And being a young, bold, new voice who was unapologetic, who is out here in the streets, and who has been an activist, I think inspired a lot of people to say, oh, like, this can be different. This can change who literally is in office, someone who looks like me, who sounds like me, and someone who's ready to fight for causes that I care about.
I love that, man. Senator Brisport, in a similar fashion, you come from the activist space as well. I'm curious to know what made you decide to run, and not only that, but how did you know that elected office would be an avenue to seek the change that you wanted to, you know, to bring about, especially coming from activism spaces where oftentimes people who organize become jaded by the political process?
Yeah, you know, like Senator Mack, similar, you know, people like me don't typically run for office, young, queer, black man. You know, you don't see many people like me holding a seat in the halls of Congress or state legislatures or even municipal offices. One big driver for me is I was a public school teacher before this, and seeing how little we invest in our students, especially our black students and students of color, was infuriating. Or when it comes to housing as well, seeing the lack of investment in affordable housing. And, you know, also like Senator Mack, you know, I came from an activist space, but, you know, being out in the streets and doing the phone calls and still not getting the responses I wanted from my elected officials made me think, well, I'll have to take it to another level and I'll have to run for office myself and enact change that way.
Word. Brandon's story, Mayor Scott's story, is just a little different to me because Baltimore's had a history of African-American mayors. I think since the 80s, you may have only had one non-black mayor. So there was visual representation there. But as we know, you know, having a black face in office doesn't mean that black policies or policies that champion marginalized group necessarily get prioritized. So for you, what was it that made you decide to take the reins, run for office, being so young, and how did you get voters to buy into your vision?
Well, for me, listen, I'm a Baltimore boy. I grew up here in Baltimore in the 80s and 90s in a neighborhood known as Park Heights, where the world descends on it for a horse race known as Preakness, and every other day of the year I wasn't even seen as human by my own city government. And while I know I stand on the shoulders of folks like Mayor Coach Smoke, I know that it's my job to take it a little further for them. And when you see and experience the things that I experienced, I saw my first shooting before my 10th birthday, went to schools with no heating, air, lost friends, and seen friends lose people to addiction. It's about not just having that representation, but in the birthplace. Baltimore is the birthplace of housing redlining legislation. In that place, having people in those places that are working to undo those policies and practices to build a better city. And the citizens of Baltimore first elected me as a city council member when I was 27 years old. I became the city council president, and what they're buying into is my continued commitment to making Baltimore better, me being my authentic self, not just from my hair, but with my voice, with my actions on the street, being a leader. I led the largest, co-led the largest anti-violence movement in the city, where 300 men marched, where me and my brothers marched on the streets at times of the night that most people wouldn't. We actually marched from Baltimore to D.C. They know what they're getting in me, someone that's going to fight for them each and every day, and that's going to do the right thing over the popular one, even if it's bad for my political career.
That's interesting that you bring that up, too, because, you know, identity matters so much in the political space. You know, as black people in professional settings, it matters probably more than it should. But like you said, you so being your authentic self, not just in your look. You know, by the way, I have fro envy right now. You know, your fro is illustrious, but not.
You got a little ways to go, my brother. A little ways to go.
You know, I don't know what you're using. We got to get offline. I don't know if it's castor oil or what, but
juices and berries.
But that identity and that authenticity, man, comes through. Because I remember I was looking at a press conference you were doing, and you were talking about COVID-19, safety measures, and you're like, come on, pull your mask up, shorty. Like, while somebody was trying to heckle you, and there's like just there's a level of respect that it seems that you engender from your constituents. You know, how important is it to show up as yourself, not only if you're a lawmaker, but black professionals who are watching this right now, who sometimes find it challenging to have to code switch and change your identity to fit within the confines of corporate structure and the workforce. And I'll start with you, Mayor Scott.
Yeah, you just have to be yourself. We have to let people know we belong in these spaces. Shout out to Shorty, who's actually a man named Shorty, an activist here that I was talking to out of love when I told him to pull his mask up. He's an elder gentleman. I don't want him getting sick from COVID. But we have to be our authentic selves each and every place we go, letting people know that we belong in these spaces no matter what anyone thinks. And that's what we have to do. And I'm going to be rejoining you guys in a second. I have to go testify. I'm trying to get control of Baltimore's police department. We're the only jurisdiction in our state, and one of two cities that doesn't control that in our city. And I'll be right back with you guys for further conversation.
Absolutely. Mayor Scott, thank you for being here for that moment, and he'll be joining us back in just one moment. I actually want to dive more into what it is that he's running to do right now, but in the meantime, I want to piggyback off that and swing it over to Jabari, because Senator Brisport, you and Senator Mack, part of what they're calling a rainbow wave, a wave of 220 LGBTQ candidates who won on election day, and your identities have been, at the forefront of what it is that how you've been able to galvanize people and get excited about this election. I mean, your run is historic. Please tell us how your win is historic, and also how your identity has played into the way you present as a lawmaker as well.
Me first, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I didn't shy away when I was running that this would be a historic election, that I would be the first queer person of color ever elected to the New York State Legislature. But, it really translates into what we're doing. So earlier this week, we were able to repeal something known as the Walking While Trans ban in New York State, which was it was an anti-loitering bill that allowed police to harass trans women on the street, accusing them of being soliciting sex work and using it to harass, detain them, so on and so forth. And they predominantly just used the bill or used the legislation to harass trans women of color. So when we repealed it, it was landmark LGBTQ legislation, and on the floor of the Senate chambers, I got to say that Black trans lives matter. And how many people say they got to do that, or how many times would that have been said before 2021? Like, we are in a radical new time, and I'm just really, really proud to be part of it.
Yeah, same question for you, Senator Mack. How did your identity play into how you presented as a lawmaker, and also your policy platform and your campaign?
Yeah, I came in unapologetically black and unapologetically queer. On every single door I knocked on, I led with, "My name is Tiara Mack, and I'm a formerly low-income black queer woman." And I had my volunteers say the same message, and I think it's really important, and it's that radical change, leading with radical authenticity. Whether or not your identities and your perspectives are valued in the current system, we're trying to work for a better system and a different system. So I'm going to live my life and present myself for that system that I see. And so that's the kind of radical I want to be. There's a lot of different definitions of radical, but I want to be radically transparent and radically myself and radically black, radically queer, and be an example for people who have never seen someone lead with radical authenticity of who they are, what they stand for, and doesn't back down from that message.
Radical authenticity. I love that so much. You know, one thing that strikes me though is sometimes, you know, we say it all the time, it's become kind of a cliche, but cliches are what they are because they're true, that the black voting bloc isn't a monolith. And I'm curious to know that when you guys were running, was there anything that you had to learn or even unlearn about the voting bloc, or any misconceptions or assumptions that you made about black voters that you kind of had to confront as you were voting? I mean, as you were running and campaigning.
I mean, I just love that question so much because, you know, we often get treated as a monolith and we're not. Just in terms of like, you know, different people have different needs. You know, the needs of black landlords are different than the needs of black tenants, and the needs of black business owners are different than the needs of black workers. But we found that, you know, by uniting around universal truths and universal demands, saying that, you know, housing was a human right and that everyone has the right to a house, or that everyone has the right to healthcare or a decent education, we were able to unite people.
Where Senator Mack, and what's interesting too is that, you know, sometimes we see queer identities in conflict with our black identity, and what we've been fighting for over the past few years since the onset of the Black Lives Matter movement all the way through the reckoning that we had in 2020 was this eye on intersectionality, you know, that queer rights, like, you know, that all black lives matter. And the problem that I've seen in some of these spaces when you have these conversations is you have members of the black community that haven't been as open to LGBTQ issues as they should be. Did you ever confront that throughout your campaign, where your identity was even a stumbling block for some black voters?
Yeah, and I struggled with that openly with folks on the door. I had people tell me, don't lead with your black, don't lead with your queer, that's not important. And I had to stand there at their door with my mask on and say, it is important. It tells a story, whether or not you see it, hear it, or believe it. Me starting every single conversation with, "I am a formerly low-income black queer woman," tells a story that is different than the current system. That is the antithesis of who we typically see in office. And it would be a disservice to me and people who look like me and everyone who's coming after me to not lead with that identity. And it starts a conversation, and it begs people to say, if this is important to you, why are you going to lead with this? And then it opens up the door for, what other things does this person care about that are intrinsic to my story? Yes, we are not a monolith, but there are certain things that connect us to everyone in our community. And it's important to always lead with your personal story so that you can get the stories of other people in your community.
I love that. Senator Mack, I want to stay with you on this one because I want to think about how important representation is, because it allows us to expand our imagination. There are little girls, little young men who are going to see you in office and know that they can be there because they've seen it. You know, I mean, my nieces, before, you know, the most recent election and the one prior, had only known a black president. So like it just opens up the floodgates of opportunity. But at the same time, you know, all skin folk ain't kinfolk. And sometimes tokenism, or somebody sitting at the seat that looks like us, doesn't necessarily mean they'll champion the policies that benefit the community. So, you know, how do we cut through? And Senator Mack, in what ways do you think that representation has its limits, and how can you, from the seat of government, begin to really implement those policies that you know our people need to progress?
Yeah, I think representation is critical. I grew up in Atlanta, and I had my first black teacher in the 2nd grade. I had my second black math teacher in the 6th grade, another black math teacher in the 8th grade. I, like Mayor Brisport, am also a former math teacher. In the school district that I worked in Southeast Massachusetts, New Bedford, I was the first black math teacher that half of my students had ever had. I was the first math teacher that could speak their language, Spanish, English, and they were like, "Oh, so you must be like us." And like they were just starving to have someone who looked like them and who was one of their teachers. And that was really important for me to say, wow, I didn't know how much I had this. And yes, I grew up during the era of Obama before I could vote and was lucky enough to be able to vote for him the second time. And I also challenged a black man in office. I challenged an anti-choice, anti-immigrant, someone who was very using his religion as the antithesis of everything that I stood for. And I got a lot of challenge for that. Why are you going against the only seated black man in Rhode Island State House? And I had to counter, I am going to be the only seated black queer woman in Rhode Island State House. We are not a monolith. The things that he was fighting for 30 years ago are radically different than the causes and the things that we need to fight for to move the needle for the future that we need to see today, tomorrow, and for the generations to come.
Senator Brisport, you want to weigh in on that? Representation versus policies that actively support the groups that we want them to support.
Yeah, well, first off, I just want to say I'm jealous of Senator Mack, because Senator, you had mad black teachers. I had one from like kindergarten through senior year. I had one at Mr. Khan in 7th grade, and he taught English. But I was a black math teacher before I was a politician, so I feel you. We need more black people teaching math. But listen, it's funny that you asked me that. Noma T, because I ran as an open socialist too, and when people say socialist, progressive, they don't think of a person that looks like me, right? They don't think that that black people occupy that space, and I just it was very important for me to be open about my political leanings, because I think black people are the most radical people there are, and Dr. King was a democratic socialist, and I do think that capitalism, racism are so deeply intertwined that it's important to be advocating for decommodification and putting more things into the hands of the people.
Word. Mayor Scott is back, and Mayor Scott, you were just talking about the power of representation, but also that representation has its limits. And I want to get your thoughts on, I was saying that all skin folk ain't kinfolk, and I was saying that, sometimes we see people at these seats of power, and they may look like us, but they don't always champion policies that represent us. From your perspective, how do you cut through that where, it's beyond representation, but actually actionable change in the way that you're doing from where you sit as mayor?
Yeah, I think it's important for us to know that. We know that all folk ain't kinfolk, skinfolk ain't kinfolk. Like, we can see that representation. We saw some folks that look like us try to overthrow the U.S. government a few weeks ago. We know that to be fact. But we also have to understand that, as we all know, all black people are not the same. And what we have to do is fight for our people. No. And yes, this is something I think we struggle with from time to time too. That yes, we can have a constructive disagreement amongst each other and not try to throw the person away because they don't agree with you on one subject or another. But what you have to be is authentically pushing policies and pushing practices that help your people. Yes, we know that sometimes there's going to be compromise. Yes, we know that everything that you want's not going to happen. Yes, we know that everyone's not going to agree with what you do. But as I stated earlier, in this moment right now, the most important thing we can have from our elected leaders, our servant leaders, is to be doing the right thing over the popular and being unapologetic about it. And we need folks who are ready to risk their political careers because they did the right thing. So what if they don't re-elect us after a few years? We've been put into place policies and actions that are going to be hard to undo, that will have benefited our communities. That's what we have to focus on. And I say that all the time, like, if they come and get me, they come and get me. But I'm going to do what I have to do right now to push us in a different way, or the alternatives to do what we've been doing, and that hasn't been working for black people.
Senator Brisport, you brought up you being a democratic socialist, and a lot of the most powerful Democrats are centrists. How do you make substantive strides, sitting from that seat as a socialist, democratic socialist, when you've got people like the former president saying that defund the police is going to make it harder for Democrats to win elections, and you're kind of going against a lot when you're in this politically charged climate where people think that there are extremes or radicals on either side. When the Democratic establishment sits in the center, how do you battle all of that?
I think the biggest way I battle it is a change in mindset. When centrists say things such as, saying that, defund the police is a dangerous slogan, they're operating from a place of fear that being too bold will cause them to lose an election, or in the case of New York right now, socialists and progressives are pushing for a big push on revenue and higher taxes on the wealthy, and some more moderate members of the Democrats are scared that this will scare the rich away and scare them out of New York. But a big part of running as a radical and as a democratic socialist is saying that we have to be hopeful about the world we want to see, and we have to believe that we are the change that we want to see in this world, and that by uniting together we are more powerful than the forces that be. So really, by uniting with my fellow lawmakers and uniting with people and movements on the ground, are we able to stand up to more moderate or more centrist people that are operating from this place of fear and saying we can't do that because we've always done it some other way.
I want to stay with you, Senator Brisport, and then Senator Mack, you can weigh in after this with the same question. What are some of the biggest challenges of going from an activist space to becoming a lawmaker? Because as Mayor Scott said, he's like, I'm going to go all in. Whether I win re-election doesn't matter because I have policies, I have things that I need to accomplish that benefit my people, and so be it. If that costs me votes. Senator Brisport, what are the biggest challenges going from the activist space, going to becoming a lawmaker, where more compromise is expected?
I would say some of the biggest challenges are dealing with sneaky procedural moves, simply not bringing things to a vote, even though something may have very, very mass appeal, making tweaks and amendments to legislation at the last minute in such a way that it's, almost no time to double check the legislation or review it. But these are all things that, again, when I did RAND, it wasn't just me, it was an army of people working together. So we do our best to ensure that, all our I's are dotted and T's are crossed, and that we are not just advancing a bold vision, but ensuring that legislatively it's going through as well.
Word. Senator Mack?
I think it is that selfish drive that we should all have, that we want to be able to live in the world that we see, the world that is founded on justice and liberation for all people. And yes, I want it for my kids. Yes, I want it for my grandkids, but I'm working too hard right now to not see it. So I think it's that impatience that being a lawmaker, that you kind of have to have conversations and you have to really show where you're not going to budge and where you're not going to compromise your values. And it is unprecedented to lead with values first in the State House. It is really hard to say that I will not support a nomination for a state commerce seat who is a corporate lobbyist, because I ran on a platform that said I would not be supporting any corporate lobbyist, anyone who takes oil money. And so when those positions come up, I have to stand firm in my belief. And sometimes that means being one of 37 no's, being one of 5 people who are willing to stand up to the status quo. And I think it's that same energy on the activist side that I keep in the State House, because again, this is a radical change in how we lead and how we govern our communities. And I will not back down from being an activist for my community, for my people, and staying true to the values that got me into office are going to be the same values that take me through the rest of my term in office and beyond.
Y'all getting me fired up right now. Mayor Scott, man, you just left earlier because you had to handle some business. Can you tell us a little bit about the business that you handled a moment ago, because it gets right to the heart of the matter, what we're talking about right now?
Yeah, we know that my city has been at the center of what I call reimagining public safety for a long time, and really since the tragic death of Freddie Gray in 2015, everyone has seen that. But for me, that fight started before that. Baltimore is the only jurisdiction in Maryland that doesn't locally control its police department. So when I was a city council person, I could not tell the police department that, for example, we passed way back in 2014 a body camera law that we actually couldn't enforce because the state controls our police department. So I was been fighting for that to happen for years. We got it through one side of our General Assembly, and today I was testifying this year on the Senate side, because we're finally at a point where we're going to actually get local control of our police department. In Maryland, we're seeing this big push for police reform. It's exciting to see so many people joining this fight that we can do this, and for us, this will mean that we will finally be able to control the destiny of this part of reimagining public safety, how we're going to be meeting our federal consent decree reforms for our department as a part of the greater conversation of reimagining public safety, where we're already starting programs where we have a pilot program for diverting, that we're working on diverting calls away from police that shouldn't go to police, right? In the home of Johns Hopkins medical system, why on earth are we sending police officers out to behavioral and substance abuse issues when we have the best behavioral and medical folks here in Baltimore City? That's the kind of conversation we're having, and having our police department be locally controlled by a black city is going to be a huge piece for us as we move forward.
Mayor Scott, I want to stay with you for a moment here too, because you know we talked at the top of the show if there's about this, and if there's one thing that I want people to take away, particularly young people, I want it to be known how important it is that people know that we can mobilize, that being involved in politics can inspire actual change. And I remember when what happened with Freddie Gray happened, a lot of folks were disheartened because Marilyn Mosby, she came out with those charges. We thought that we were going to see things happen, and then it didn't come out the way a lot of people wanted it to come out. Yet, right now, to this day, you're still fighting for those same things. How, from the seat of government, can we seek out substantive change, and why should young people not be jaded with the political process, those who are organizing in the streets right now?
Yeah, and I think that for us here locally, like that was a point where we had a lot of people become involved in action, in political action, and specifically in lawmaking. Those are the same very people that are still testifying on the piece that I just finished testifying on, and also these other reform efforts. What we need is, when you have a flashbang point like that, we need our community to stay engaged. Like what I would always say back then to our young people here is that these cameras are going to leave, but we're not. We're going to have to be here. We're going to have to live here. And if we want it to change, we have to understand, we have to play the long game. No, the state's attorney wasn't able to get the results that she sought with that through trials here in Baltimore City, right? So we know, but from that, we have a federal consent decree. We're meeting that. There's a lot of reforms happening. We also, in Maryland, are going through one of the largest reforming of police law and police protection in the country. All of that can be tracked back to activism that started here in Baltimore City by young people. Every movement that this country has ever seen has been guided by young people. And what I want young people to do is take that anger, that frustration, and put it into practice. Put it into holding your lawmakers accountable. Put it into suggesting legislation. Put it into running for office. Make sure that you do that with the buy-in and support of the community. There's nothing worse than someone who wants to run for office in a community which they have done no work. Put the work in now, put the work in continuously, so that change will continue to come. It's not going to happen overnight. Changing laws is a long process in many different places and cases, and we have to continue to fight on that, and we cannot do that without young voices. Here in Baltimore, I can think about some of the things that I never would have thought possible, right? For example, it wasn't until teenagers, high school students came here to Baltimore in the city council and testified about us banning styrofoam and plastic bags that it actually happened. That was what got it over the hump. We know that young people can be involved in that. When you think about those young people that are fighting for police reform in Maryland, that's what actually happened. When I saw our young people testify for the blueprint for Maryland's future, which we just, our General Assembly just overrode our governor's veto, which will fully fund public schools. Hearing those students is what actually made it happen. Young people, know your voices are heard, continue to make them heard, and don't be shy to do that in any shape or form.
Senator Brisport, what would you like for our activists, or rather, what would you like for our viewers to know about what they can do inspired by this conversation, they want to act, they want to support your agenda. What is our viewers' homework? What can they do to make sure that they're helping you guys push the policies forward that mean the most to our communities?
Thanks, Nomati. I want to just start by showing how quickly activists can move the needle. Just going back to police reform, in 2017, New York City, the biggest police reform battle was something called the Right to Know Act, which literally required police to tell you who they are and why they are detaining you. And that was what the big struggle was to get them to agree to that or get legislators to do that. 3 years later, we had encampments outside of City Hall demanding that we defund the NYPD by $1 billion. And this year, we now have mayoral candidates even talking about defunding the NYPD by $3 billion. And that is all in the course of 3-4 years because of what activists on the ground are doing and the amount of pressure they're applying. The biggest battle in New York right now is to raise revenue. If we are not able to get that passed and get that through the governor, there will be service cuts to healthcare, education, housing, transportation, and these are all hurt Black people, people of color, the worst. So if you are in New York, I encourage you to Google the Invest in Our New York package of bills and sign up to help, because we have 7 weeks or 6 weeks left to do it.
Wow. Gave us some real tangible homework right there. Invest in our New York. And again, I can't drive this point home enough, particularly in Black History Month, that there are ways to really bring about the change that we're talking about and marching about, both in the streets and from those legislative seats that you guys occupy. Same question to you, Senator Mack.
Yeah, I guess my first piece of homework is change your definitions of what politics looks like. A lot of people tell me, and I even told myself, I'm not a politician. I do not look like a politician. I could never be in politics, but my world is inherently political. Every aspect of me being a Black, queer, formerly low-income woman is inherently political. I had to change my definition of what it meant to be political and to be a politician. And so I also think we should change what it looks like to lead. Activism is at the core of what it means to lead and to govern. So let's change our definition of what power looks like, because when power is shared amongst people and those ideas are shared amongst people and we have people-powered movements, we can literally move the needle even faster than what we've seen. And we've seen so much progress in the last couple of years, and we have a long way to go, but I'm sure with that change in definition and with activists on the ground, we will see that future. The arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, and we are on our way towards justice.
That is beautiful. Mayor Scott, I'm going to give you the last word on this one. What is our viewers' homework? What can we do to support the policies that you believe in?
Listen, stay involved, right? I think that my counterpart said it best. There's a movement afoot. There's places for everyone to fit. Know your issue. Everyone's not going to run for office, but everyone is going to be impacted by those decisions. Make sure that you're holding people accountable. Make sure that you're activating yourself. If you care about public safety reform or reimagining, get involved in that. If you care about sustainability and environment, get involved in that. If you care about changing how we do our taxes and how we generate our revenue, get involved in that. But also for Black viewers in particular, young Black people, don't allow anyone else to tell you what you need in your community. You know best. You lived it. As I often tell my counterparts across the country, and some even here, none of them will ever know what it's like to grow up poor in Baltimore City the way I do. Reading in a book is not living it. You are the subject matter expert on what impacts your life and how it impacts your life. Make sure that you remind people of that, and that's why it's important for you to stay engaged, and important for many of you to end up in these seats so that you can make our cities and our towns and our counties the best versions of themselves that they've ever been.
And with that, we've got our marching orders. These ladies and gentlemen have powerful work to do, and I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your busy schedules to have this conversation. It was enriching to me personally, so I know it was even more so, hopefully, for our viewers. So I want to thank you, Senator Jabari Brisport, Mayor Brandon Scott, and Senator Tiara Mack for taking time to have this conversation and just inspire folks who are watching, who one day want to sit in the seats that you're holding, because we are normalizing being radically authentic, and that's what's most inspiring to me, man. This is Black excellence on display right here, so thank you guys for being here. Peace. Blessings to you.
Thank you.
I'm Nomati Pongo, and this has been MTV News. You Need to Know.